Cardinal Seán now preaches to the priest directly and to all of us gathered here for the Chrism Mass.
And I welcome all of you to our Chrism Mass, where we gather for what I like to call the annual oil change and spiritual tune-up. St. Jerome used to call the Holy Land the fifth gospel, and I believe he's right. Visiting the various venues mentioned in the gospel makes it all come alive. But even without any first-hand knowledge, the various places mentioned in the gospel do take on special meaning for us. We have named the chapel at the pastoral center the Bethany Chapel, because at Bethany Jesus went to be at home with his dear friends Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Martha's words from the Gospel of John grace the wall of the chapel in Braintree. Magister adest et vocat te. The Master is here, and he's calling you. When I was studying at St. Fidelis of Sigmaringen Seminary as an Irish infiltrator there, affectionately known as the Capuchin Agricultural School, I was part of a group that the rector dubbed the Gerasenes. Father Rector would routinely rouse us at 2 o'clock in the morning to go to the parish cemetery because our herd of swine had escaped from their corral and descended like those swine filled with legions of demons that hurled themselves into the sea. But our pigs descended upon the fresh graves of pious German farmers. There in the middle of the night, dressed in our nightshirts and wielding baseball bats and 2x4s, we would drive the beasts back to their muddy pens. I dare say Monsignor Moroni doesn't have any Gerasenes defending Cardinal O'Connell's grave in case of attack by possessed swine. Still in all, the Holy Land is the fifth gospel. Today at the Chrism Mass, I'd like to reflect on the theological meanings insinuated by two different venues in the gospel. According to the scriptures, Jesus' earthly life begins at Bethlehem and ends in Jerusalem. But the truth is, Jesus spent very little time in those two places. Most of Jesus' life was spent in Nazareth and Capernaum. Indeed, Jesus was known as the Nazarene. Today's gospel depicts Jesus giving his first sermon in the synagogue at Nazareth. The gospel ends with the powerful phrase, "Today this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing." The gospel continues in another vein as we read on. First, Luke comments that all spoke highly of Jesus and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. But it didn't take long before they were saying, "Aren't you Joseph's boy? Do here in your native place the things we heard you have done in Capernaum." Jesus replied by pointing out that prophets are not accepted in their hometowns and used Elijah and Elisha, who worked miracles for foreigners, as illustrations. The Spanish have a great proverb used to describe someone who changes from place to place in order with hopes of changing themselves. They say, "La fiebre no está en las sábanas." The fever is not in the sheets, it's in the patient. Sometimes the venue, however, is part of who we are. You can take the boy out of Southie, but you can't take Southie out of the boy. In Jesus' life, there are two venues that are so important to his identity and his mission: Nazareth and Capernaum. After Jerusalem, they are the cities most mentioned in the Gospels. The concordance shows that Nazareth appears 15 times, and Capernaum is mentioned 16 times. For a long time, Capernaum was abandoned, and even the memory of where it stood was lost. But it was rediscovered, and in 1894, the Franciscan custody of the Holy Land acquired the land and continued the excavations of the synagogue and the site of Peter's house, described in the 4th century testimony of the pilgrim Egeria. A couple of years ago, I visited Capernaum with a group of priests. We saw the magnificent ruins of that synagogue built by the centurion whose prayer is repeated in our liturgy, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof." There, in the place where Jesus gives us the Eucharistic discourse recorded in chapter 6 of John's Gospel, we read aloud the "I am the bread of life" sermon. There at that synagogue where Jesus preached so many times is probably the very place where Jesus cures Jairus' young daughter, as well as the woman with the hemorrhages and the man with the withered hand. The Gospel of John says that Mary went to Capernaum with Jesus after the wedding feast of Cana and describes so many of the Lord's activities there, what he did on the lake shore, and in particular what he did in the synagogue and at the house of Peter and Andrew. That house was not only a place where Jesus lived, but it was a house of formation for his disciples, a beautiful and eloquent image of the church. The evangelist Mark sheds even more light on Peter's house in the mystery of the church. He says that after proclaiming the parables and other teachings to the crowds, Jesus would give a private lesson back at Peter's house. The house was often so crowded with disciples, it was impossible to get in. Mary and the apostles had to wait outside, and the friends of the paralytic had to open a hole in the roof to get their friend close to Jesus. I like to think of Peter's house at Capernaum as the field hospital that Pope Francis speaks of. The Gospels tell us that the people brought the sick and the suffering from miles around to the doors of Peter's house. We celebrated Mass on the site of Peter's house. In the ruins, there are many evidences that the early Christians had made a church house out of this compound where Peter, Andrew, Peter's mother-in-law, and his extended family lived with Jesus. His house was a beehive of apostolic activity, of preaching, of healing, of forming ministers. At Capernaum, as in our ministry, Jesus also experiences frustration, failure, disappointment. At one point, Jesus complained that if Sodom and Gomorrah had as much ministry performed there as had been done in Capernaum, those people would have been converted long ago. Our expectations, our hopes for success need to be tempered by the conviction that one man sows and another reaps. We cannot always have the consolation of the fruit of our labor. Our Capernaum can be tough. I always say being Catholic in Boston is a contact sport. There can be a lot of heartbreak in Capernaum. The 30-year stint in Nazareth begins when Jesus returns to Nazareth after a brief exile in Egypt. I say return because Jesus was conceived in Nazareth at the Annunciation. In the basilica there, the spot is marked by the inscription, Verbum caro factum est. After the death of Herod, Joseph takes Mary and the Christ child back to the land of Israel, but hearing that Herod's son Archelaus was ruling over Judea, Joseph, warned in a dream, goes to Galilee to the town of Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. But he could just as easily have been called a Capharnaumer. The two poles of Jesus' life are Nazareth and Capernaum. Reflecting on this reality has important implications for our own priesthood. 3 decades of Jesus' short life on earth were lived at Nazareth. 3 years, those years were an important preface to what followed in his public ministry. We must be convinced that Jesus' long hidden life was not a wasted period, nor that he was treading water. It was a crucial part of his sojourn on earth, part of his identity and his mission. In Nazareth, I was pleased to visit the Poor Clare Monastery, where Charles de Foucauld lived as gardener and a handyman. I asked the nuns for a job. They said I wasn't qualified. In his homily for the beatification of Blessed Charles de Foucauld, Pope Benedict says that at Nazareth, Blessed Charles discovered the truth about the humanity of Jesus and invites us to contemplate the mystery of the Incarnation. Blessed Charles discovered that Jesus, who came to join us in our humanity, invites us to universal brotherhood. As a priest, Blessed Charles placed the Eucharist and the Gospel at the heart of his life. The two tables of the Word and the bread are the source of Christian life and mission. At Nazareth, we see Jesus' kenosis, his self-emptying in the Incarnation. Jesus is sent by the Father to proclaim the good news to the world. The long and hidden years of Nazareth are part of the gospel message. Jesus at Nazareth takes on a poor person's condition and makes ordinary daily life a meeting place with the Father. Nazareth is a place of Jesus' hidden life, an ordinary life, a place of family life, of prayer, of work, silent virtues, hospitality, friendship, routine, a banal repetition of simple chores and tedious tasks. It's also a place of community, sharing both sorrows and joys. It's a place of a simple lifestyle, of humble service, of reciprocal love. In the lives of our priests, we need Nazareth and Capernaum. There's a tension between the two, but it behooves each priest to resolve that tension by embracing both aspects of our priestly life. Jesus spent 30 years in Nazareth and 3 in Capernaum, 10 times longer in Nazareth. As Americans, we're very prone to activism and more comfortable in Capernaum, but we need Nazareth if Capernaum is going to work for us. For a priest, Nazareth is that safe place, the intimacy of being close to a small circle of friends and family who share our faith and ideals. Nazareth is a time and space to grow in our relationship with the Eucharist and the Word of God. Nazareth is where intimacy with the Lord allows us to embrace a simple lifestyle, celibacy, and to persevere in ministry and confront failure. Nazareth is that oasis of prayer and spirituality without which it is impossible to cross the desert, to carry the treasure to God's people waiting on the other side in Capernaum. Nazareth keeps Christ at the center of our lives. His friendship becomes the motor force in our ministry. Nazareth is about friendship, personal renewal, study, prayer, growing in self-knowledge, a sense of purpose born of our love for the gospel. Even when he was at Capernaum, Jesus made Nazareth moments in his life, prayer late at night, 40 days of retreat and prayer and fasting, hours in the Garden of Olives. Without Nazareth, we can spin out of control and drift away from God and from our brothers. Without Nazareth, we can become too self-absorbed, obsessing about our privacy, our time, our hobbies, our creature comforts that we use to compensate for celibacy and other sacrifices inherent in our vocation. Nazareth can equip us with a deep faith life that gives passion to our ministry. Without Nazareth, Capernaum can become overwhelming, frustrating, and can alienate us. Capernaum is the other pole in the priest's life. It's ministry, pastoral love, service, laying down one's life for the sheep. Just as in the gospel, Capernaum is about preaching the gospel and healing the sick. At Capernaum, Jesus and the apostles were staying at Peter's house. The paradigm for church is always family, with the in-laws and the outlaws and the mother-in-laws. Peter's household comes equipped with a mother-in-law who was a good cook. Capernaum demonstrates Jesus' predilection for the sick and the suffering. A Christ-like priest always sees a special mission to the suffering as a priority in his ministry. As today's gospel proclaims, our mission is to be messengers of the good news to the poor and to liberate those oppressed by the circumstances of their lives. Our pastoral planning must underscore the importance of building communities that are indeed Christ's family. A priest must be a builder of unity in the family of the parish, connecting our people with God and with each other. Capernaum is also a venue for training people for ministry. The apostles received much of their formation in Peter's house. An important part of our task in Capernaum is to promote priestly vocations as well as lay ministry in the church, so that our church will truly become an evangelizing community, calling people to be evangelizers and disciple makers. A culture of encounter and the art of accompaniment that Pope Francis speaks about so often must characterize our Capernaum experience. Much of Jesus' vocational recruitment activities center in the area of Capernaum. It was there that Jesus calls Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Matthew. Part of our Capernaum experience as priests must be a constant concern for promoting vocations by challenging our young people to consider a call to ministry in their lives. A few years ago, I was privileged to be in my home parish where we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the parish. There were 40 priests, all vocations from the parish, celebrating the Mass. At our St. Andrew's dinners and the vocational retreats, it's obvious that some communities are very serious about referring young men, yet other parishes never send anyone. Our hope is that pastoral planning will help all of our people to realize how important the vocation ministry is for the future of the church. For our priests, inviting young men to consider a priestly vocation must be a pastoral priority. All studies indicate how powerful the invitation of a priest is. As it was as Jesus' main focus at Capernaum, it must be a priority in our Capernaum of daily ministry. It's the way that we attend not only to the present pastoral needs of our people, but also the future needs of the community of faith. Nazareth and Capernaum need to be constants in the life of a priest. As we are living longer, we have another opportunity to spend more time in Nazareth, more time in adoration and prayer, so that like Aaron and Hur, we might hold up Moses' arms during the battle. Our prayer allows us to continue to contribute to the life of faith in our church. In the beautiful gospel scene of the presentation in the temple, we see Mary with the baby, Joseph with the birds, but we also see the seniors praying, witnessing, and encouraging. They are protagonists in the unfolding mission of the church. Simeon and Anna are a sign of hope and a source of spiritual power in the church. Many of our retired priests tell me how fervently they're praying for our church. Their priestly service continues in the Nazareth mode of their ministry. Many of our senior priests, whose tireless work build up the parishes and ministries of the archdiocese, are now our prayer warriors, whose intercession is a source of strength to our presbyterate and our people, as the center of gravity shifts from Capernaum to Nazareth in their lives. To me, Pope Francis's call to embrace the culture of encounter and the art of accompaniment is reflected in the virtue common to both Nazareth and Capernaum, that of hospitality. The Holy Father encourages us to be open and welcoming. Pope Francis once spoke of a parish secretary in the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires who was known as the tarantula. Andrew Greeley, in his book, The Catholic Revolution, has suggested that bishops, priests, and parish staff members ought to have a course from the people who administer the Four Seasons hotel chain on how to be friendly and attractive to the people they welcome to the sacraments. As it is now, Father Greeley claims, it often seems that we've been trained by the U.S. Postal Service. What's wrong with the Postal Service? In his pastoral letters, where Paul describes the attributes of those who are called to ministry, hospitality ranks very high. The epistles are sprinkled with a call to be hospitable. In Hebrews we read, "Love of the brethren must continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it." In the parable of the Last Judgment, Jesus says, "I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." Even those blessed did not know that they were welcoming Jesus in a distressing disguise, as Mother Teresa used to say. When we invite Christ into our lives, and that is what the hospitality of Nazareth is about, Christ, who is the guest, becomes the host, as he did for the disciples on the road to Emmaus. At the Last Supper, the first Eucharist and ordination, it is prefaced by the most profound ceremony of hospitality performed by Jesus, who washes the feet of his apostles. Our pastoral planning and efforts at evangelization will be successful only to the degree that we priests live a spirit of hospitality of Nazareth, as well as the hospitality of Peter's house at Capernaum. The hospitality of the gospel is about welcoming the stranger, and like the Good Samaritan, making the stranger the object of our love, part of our community, even a brother. Gospel hospitality is always disinterested. When you have a banquet, Jesus says, don't just invite rich neighbors and friends who can reciprocate, but invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. In inviting them, we're inviting Christ, and we will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Hospitality is about building relationships and forming community. In our parishes, hospitality must be contagious, and it should begin with the open, welcoming spirit of the clergy, who must teach by example and witness by their words. A great priest once said, "The two happiest questions a priest can hear from someone are, 'Father, will you hear my confession?' and 'Father, how can I become a Catholic?'" Whenever you visit a convent of the Missionaries of Charity of Mother Teresa, you'll find in the chapel wall next to the crucifix the words, "I thirst." Christ is thirsting for souls. The priest, like the Good Shepherd, is anxious to bring the sheep on the periphery to center stage. The priest is always a man of hospitality, welcoming the prodigal son or daughter, binding up the wounds of the stranger left half dead by the roadside, feeding the hungry with bread, forgiveness, and hope. The hospitality of Nazareth, welcoming Christ, letting the Word become flesh in our hearts, is what prepares us for the hospitality of Capernaum, of the field hospital. Today's celebration is to remind us that we're not alone, that our priesthood unites us to Christ and to one another in a profound and permanent relationship. The ordination ceremony, where the entire presbytery imposes hands on the newly ordained and then comes forward to give them the kiss of peace, is a striking sign of the hospitality we need to practice with each other, looking out for our brothers, encouraging them and helping them. As we renew our priestly vows together today, we commit to be part of an intentional presbyterate, a band of brothers committed to living the hospitality of Nazareth and Capernaum, so that the love of the Good Shepherd will be present and visible, especially at the periphery, so that the anointing that we share may reach all of God's people and fill their hearts with hope and joy. Spelling bees are being relegated to the dustbin of a pre-virtual age, being surpassed by spell check on the computer. But I still find spelling bees stimulating. Recently, one of the arcane words used in the National Spelling Bee in Washington was Capernaum. The definition in Webster's unabridged dictionary is Capernaum, a confused jumble, a place marked by disorderly accumulation of objects, like the crowd in front of Peter's house in Capernaum. In the French dictionary, the word for Capernaum is similar, l'endroit en désordre. I'm convinced that our ministry can be Capernaum, a confused and disordered jumble, if the Nazareth values of contemplation, prayer, intimate friendship, and the sense of fraternity are lacking. As we renew our priestly vows, let us commit ourselves to live with one foot in Nazareth and one foot in Capernaum, to be priests after the heart of the Good Shepherd. God bless you.